Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Steve Fox. He is the co-founder of the National Cannabis Industry Association, also a lawyer here in Washington, D.C. that deals with issues when it comes to marijuana. Good morning to you.
Morning, Pedro.
What did the United States decide in this past election about this idea of how marijuana is used either recreationally or medically?
Yeah, it was actually a pretty big election. We had 9 initiatives on the ballot. 5 of them were for all adult use and 4 were related to medical marijuana, and 8 out of 9 ended up passing, including 4 out of 5 of the adult use measures, with the initiatives passing in California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada. The medical marijuana states that passed were Arkansas, first state truly in the South to pass a medical marijuana measure, Florida, North Dakota, and then Montana expanded upon its existing medical marijuana program.
Why do you think there is a change, not only in these states you talked about, but other states that have gone down this road as well?
Sure. Well, this has been evolving for decades, starting with the first medical marijuana initiative that passed in California in 1996. We've just seen support for reforming marijuana laws increase, just about 1 or 2 points a year, to the point now where the most recent Pew and Gallup surveys had support for legalization at 57 and 60%. So there's really been a tremendous increase. And I think it's based on the fact that people understand that marijuana isn't as bad as it was made out to be. Not saying it's without, some harms associated with it, but overall, given the grand scope of various substances and so on, they just realize that it isn't worth punishing individuals for using marijuana, and basically the changes in the law have followed that.
So now that the changes are made in the statewide level, let me ask you, how much influence does the federal government make or have over these statewide decisions?
Yeah, there's significant federal involvement potentially, and what we've had over the past, I guess, 3 years officially, there have been, to educate the viewers a bit, in 2012, Colorado and Washington passed legalization measures in those states. In response, the Obama administration issued guidance in August 2013, which basically said that if you are acting in compliance with state laws, you will not be a federal law enforcement priority. Mm-hmm. And that allowed individuals in those states, as well as the medical marijuana states, to understand that if they were operating in strict compliance with state law, that they could move forward without concern of federal interference. And that now is the question moving forward with the Trump administration.
What's the largest question then?
The question is whether that Cole memo guidance from 2013 will continue, and whether it will be there on paper saying to operators that if you're acting in compliance with state law, that you will not be a federal law enforcement priority.
We'll continue on with this conversation, but if you have questions for our guests concerning this idea of marijuana, not only what's happening on the statewide level, but what it means for the incoming administration, you can call and give our guests a call, our questions or comments on this topic, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans. For independents, 202-748-8002, with the Senator Jeff Sessions being mentioned as potential Attorney General. Mm-hmm. First of all, what's his stance, if any, he's taken on this idea of marijuana?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to look up the record, you would see that he has had some pretty strong anti-marijuana statements in the past. He doesn't seem to be much in favor of the use of marijuana. And we'll have to see where that goes. I mean, he's also had, stances that were supportive of federalism and the idea that states should be able to determine their own laws. So there'll be a balance there, and we'll see where it comes down.
So if he were interested in doing something about it, give a for instance of what he might do or could do as Attorney General when it comes to what's happening on the state level.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you come right down to it, despite all of this action at the state level, where we now have 28 states plus the District of Columbia that have made the medical use of marijuana legal, along with the now 8 states plus the District of Columbia that have made adult use legal, marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. That hasn't changed. The Department of Justice has the ability to prosecute individuals who are engaged in marijuana-related activity. We're hoping they don't, but it's possible. And therefore, when you ask what's possible, really, anything's on the table. But the question is whether the state laws will be respected.
So someone's operating a dispensary, even though on the statewide level it's legal, the federal government can come in and shut it down?
Yes. Yes, they could.
Do you think Donald Trump is interested in doing that?
Well, he has said he isn't. He's said that this is a state's issue. When asked specifically by a reporter in Colorado whether he would allow his attorney general to go after state legal businesses, he had said that it was a state's issue and he wouldn't want his attorney general going after it. So we'll have to see how that plays out. We hope he's true to his word on that.
Steve Fox joining us. He's the co-founder of the National Cannabis Industry Association. It seems obvious, but tell us the people you represent under that association.
Sure. The National Cannabis Industry Association now represents more than 1,000 businesses that are engaged in the cannabis industry in some capacity. That may be people who are dispensaries or cultivators or producers, but also many other businesses from law firms, including the one where I work, which is Vicente Cederberg, just to give the plug there, as well as accounting firms and many other ancillary businesses.
We have calls lined up for you, and the first one comes from Bernie, and Bernie is in New York. Independent line, Bernie, you're on with our guest, Steve Fox. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Good morning. I'm really amazed that we continue to have a federal law in conflict with state law. When is the federal law going to be changed, and why hasn't it already been addressed?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, part of the answer is that things move slowly at the federal level, which isn't news to anyone. But we have seen progress. There are appropriations riders. If you're not familiar with those are amendments that are placed on appropriations bills that can limit the way federal funds are spent. And we've had one appropriations rider, which was called the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, which actually passed and is part of the current appropriations bill, which prohibits the federal government from spending any money to interfere with state medical marijuana laws. So you've had that kind of movement. We've also seen movement in both chambers in favor of helping banks work with cannabis industry companies. So we see movement along the way, but it takes a little effort to get full legislation passed to make it legal on the state level as well as the federal level.
George from Salisbury, Maryland, Democrats line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. This is George from Salisbury, Maryland. I'm a former addictions counselor, and I think legalization of marijuana is a terrible idea. It's an extremely dangerous drug. It causes all sorts of things. It causes sterility. It causes all sorts of things. It interrupts the menstrual process. I have treated people who have lost jobs, almost lost their lives with marijuana use, and I think you ought to be ashamed of yourself for even thinking about legalizing such a dangerous chemical. Thank you.
Sure. I know some people feel that marijuana's harms are too extreme to justify making it legal. I disagree in this basic sense, and this is probably the best way of explaining it, is that by basically every objective measure, and this has been a conclusion of numerous, basically every government study ever done, is that marijuana is objectively less harmful than alcohol, a substance it's accepted in our society and widely used in our society. Maybe some people think it shouldn't be, but it clearly is. And marijuana is less addictive than alcohol, less toxic than alcohol, less likely to be associated with acts of violence. And we simply don't see any reason that we should punish adults who prefer to use the less harmful of the two substances, and that's the bottom line of where we come from.
Because twice you've mentioned the harms. What are the harms then, as you see it? Tell us what harms of marijuana use could be.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you don't want people driving after consuming. It can impair judgment. Inhaling smoke is not necessarily good for anyone in any sense. But you know, beyond that, a lot of the supposed harms that have been talked about in the past, you know, we could go down the line, whether it's kills brain cells. That's something people always says. If you do the research now, you would find that marijuana actually protects brain cells, and that's why it can slow the progression of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's is useful, very useful for people with epilepsy. There used to be claims that marijuana causes cancer. But long-term studies that have been done have shown that actually it can reduce incidence of cancer, that there's no increased risk even of lung cancer. UCLA did a large study one time, and that proved not to be true. So the harms really are somewhat limited. I mean, I do want to be, concede to some people who may say that it has harms, that it may have some harms. I'm not saying it's absolutely harmless, but in the grand scheme of things, compared to alcohol, cigarettes, fast food, and so on, the long-term harms seem to be pretty limited.
Are we seeing more powerful strains of marijuana being created? And is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, you do see strains that are higher in THC content, which is the intoxicating part. We haven't seen any studies that really show that is causing a significant increase in harm. I mean, in some way, people know to titrate, meaning measure their dose, and if it's stronger, they'll simply have less, which in the sense of inhaling smoke, I suppose, is a good thing. But as it's become stronger over time and it's widely used in our society, we haven't seen incidences of mental illness or whatever increase because of that.
Let's hear from Keith, and he is in Toledo, Ohio, Republican line. Keith, go ahead, you're on.
Good morning. I agree with everything this man is saying. I am very much pro-marijuana. I have a concern with the new election if it'll be harder for the states, because it's still against federal, and I wonder maybe if they will change the scheduling of the drug. I'm not, it should be legal, because to put people, to incarcerate people that smoke this is just ridiculous. It doesn't help our society whatsoever. And even though smoking marijuana, cigarettes, alcohol, I think it'd be better if nobody did any of it. None of it should be illegal.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. A couple things there. I just want to mention the scheduling, because that does come up. One thing to note is that marijuana's, the penalties associated with marijuana at the federal level aren't connected to what schedule it's in. So you could move marijuana to Schedule 2, Schedule 3, or whatever, and you would still have those penalties associated with marijuana. What we need to do is remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act entirely, and treat it, like alcohol at the federal level. Of course, there are other people who feel like maybe it should just be treated as a medicine or a dietary supplement. These are things that need to be figured out and should. One other thing I would mention related to what he said is he said there's no reason to arrest or punish individuals for using marijuana, and obviously we agree, but we really want to make sure that there's a larger point being made here, and that is that tens of millions of Americans do use marijuana, sometimes as an alternative to alcohol, sometimes just because they enjoy it. And they need to get it somewhere, or they do get it somewhere, and that's what these states are doing. It's not just making marijuana legal for adults, it's also setting up systems of distribution and sale that are regulated and monitored, seed to sale tracking. They test the marijuana to make sure it's clean and pure. and then it's sold and taxed, which generates revenue for the states. Colorado last year took in $135 million in tax revenue at the state level. It will take in more than $150 million this year, and that's money that's going to public school construction, public education programs, anti-bullying programs, addressing homelessness issues, and so on. And these are funds that can really be used. And if the federal government comes in and shuts this down, it just means all of this revenue is going back underground and towards criminals and cartels.
Al from Camano, Washington, Camano Island, Washington, Independent Line.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. You know, the previous caller hits the head of the nail. Let me strike it one more time. This is a revenue-generating law that is used at local, county, state, and federal. Why do you think we have for-profit prison systems that must operate at 90% capacity? You need these little laws to generate money for profit for Wall Street. Now, I think that the glut for profit in America is becoming really shameful because it's eating the people. Marijuana is something that, when it's not being abused, is very helpful. So I could go on and on with this, but the point is, it's for profit, it's for greedy people, it's for Wall Street, and who gives a damn about who gets hurt? No, thank you for the call, and I know there's a lot of intelligent people out here, so check into this. You'll see.
Thanks for the call. I guess a number of issues potentially to address there. But I guess I'd like to focus on where he said that people aren't getting hurt by using marijuana. It's an opportunity to talk about the people that do use marijuana. You're seeing articles now about players in the NFL. I think more than a majority in a recent survey said they would want to be able to use marijuana in many cases because it's a better way for them to help treat their pain. We've seen studies now that show that where medical marijuana is legal, you have about a 25% reduction, it seems, in opioid use, which is obviously a really serious drug problem in this country. We also see that veterans frequently use marijuana to help alleviate PTSD symptoms and to help them sleep at night. It's also something that middle-aged people use to help them sleep when they're feeling stressed or have insomnia or whatever. So it really, we need to change the way people think of marijuana users. There have been, stereotypes in the past about what a typical marijuana user looks like, but it's really not the case, and all kinds of people use marijuana, and they certainly shouldn't be punished or threatened with jail for doing so.
Mike from Ellicott City, Maryland, Democrats line, you're on.
Yes, how you doing? I love this discussion. I agree with the other callers. I have a question. Wouldn't it make more sense that if the states legalize marijuana, that they would make it affordable for people so that the average drug dealer wouldn't have you would take a lot of violence and things away from people that sell drugs on the street, because no matter how many distilleries you have, you can get marijuana anywhere. That's why it's really simple that it's even illegal in the first place. The only people that pay are the people that get pulled over because they got smoked, they're going to lose their job or because they had a joint in the ashtray. But at the end of the day, you can get marijuana anywhere. You don't need to have a convention. I mean, people got marijuana everywhere. But my whole thing is I agree with the dispensaries and things like that. But what do you do? Why do you make it so expensive that the average person would never walk into a dispensary and pay $500 for an ounce when they could get one for $100? I mean, if you're going to do it as though you take over the industry and you knock out the violence that comes with it, because there will be no more drug dealers, because who can compete with the state? Thank you.
Sure, and that's an interesting issue that has come up in the states where they have passed these laws to make marijuana legal for all adults. They do think about the tax that's being imposed and try to make sure that the tax isn't so onerous that it keeps prices above the price that it might be on the street. And I think what we're seeing is that there is, those taxes are being kept relatively reasonable. They still are somewhat steep. In Colorado, for example, you have an effective tax rate once you put all the taxes together of almost 25%. But at the same time, as there are efficiencies in the cultivation process and so on, you do see prices coming down. And we see that it seems like more than 70% of the market in Colorado now is through the legal regulated system. And we believe that will continue to grow over time as people become accustomed to going to stores and don't want to be seeking other means on the street to get marijuana, which won't be tested and properly labeled and so on.
There was a recent op-ed in the LA Times by a gentleman named Robert McCune. He's out of Stanford Law. He's a social psychologist. He makes this idea about the concerns about legalization of marijuana. He draws these 2 points. He says, first, legalization is likely to reduce the average harm per dose of marijuana. Some of these reductions will be pharmacological, the result of better quality control and predictability in legal production. But he also says legalization can also be expected to increase the number of doses consumed simply because it'll be easier to obtain. In the end, total harm related to marijuana could rise even if the average harm per dose falls. What do you think about that logic?
Again, it gets back to what you see as the harms associated with marijuana, but to just for the sake of conversation concede that there may be some harms associated. I think, again, going back to the alcohol issue, you just have to compare the two. That assumption by that columnist is that there will be more doses and therefore more harm. But how many doses of alcohol are there? And are some doses of alcohol being substituted for marijuana? Because if a dose of alcohol has more harm than a dose of marijuana, we're actually reducing harm in society if people have a dose of marijuana instead of a dose of alcohol. So you can't just look at marijuana by itself and say that we're increasing the level of harm in society. It's a much bigger picture and needs to be studied.
Because you said alcohol's supposed to be sold to adults. We know that kids drink it. Mm-hmm. Drugs are supposed to be sold to adults. We know that kids drink it. Why not the same for marijuana? Are there concerns about young people, underage people getting a hold of it?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And we want to have the same systems. What we've seen over the past 20 years is that through enforcement of regulations like the We Card program and so on, that over the last 20 years there's been a significant drop in alcohol use and a significant drop in tobacco use, both among teens. But marijuana use has been flat. So certainly an argument could be made that once we put it in stores and make it harder for teens to acquire. Right now, teens say it's very easy to acquire with it all being illegal, and like one of the callers said, it's almost everywhere. So once we regulate it and put it in stores that have to card, we could actually push for a reduction in teen use. And what we've seen in Colorado is that teen use was at about 25%, back in 2011, and it's at 21% now. So it seems like there has been some decline in Colorado, certainly not a steep increase of any kind. And we'll continue to work at that and educate teens and try to reduce teen use.
Steve Fox, our guest, the co-founder of the National Cannabis Industry Association, also deals at a law firm in town. How did you become a pot lawyer? And sorry for the term, it's just the easiest way I can describe it.
Yeah, well, I've always been more of a policy person. I've been lobbying on this issue since 2002, so almost 15 years now, starting with the Marijuana Policy Project and have just been lobbying since that time. Most of the work I do at the law firm is policy related.
And so is this working with states interested in this or groups interested in getting legalization?
In terms of the policy work?
Or, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the law firm, works with clients who are engaged in the state legal industry. In terms of the work I do, it's working on ballot initiatives and working with other groups like the National Cannabis Industry Association, trying to change the laws on the federal level. So it's a variety of work.
What is the next round of states interested in looking at this issue?
Yeah, well, we could probably see a few more states moving towards medical. It could be a wide variety. With now Arkansas and Florida moving in that direction, there have been conversations in Georgia, Texas, and others. In terms of adult use, Rhode Island has always been looking at this seriously. Now with Massachusetts making it legal, there could be a greater push there, since their residents may just drive to Massachusetts now. So why not make it legal in Rhode Island? And we'll see. Vermont's another one that has shown some momentum in the past, so that may be possible.
Let's hear next from Earl in Burlington, Massachusetts. Independent line.
Yes. Hi, this calls Mr. Fox. A question for you regarding marijuana and Native Americans. What do you see happening for Native Americans' inclusion in the states that have decided to, such as Massachusetts, allow marijuana use to be part of it? And secondly, what do you feel about the costs, because they're rather high for inclusion into this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I mentioned earlier that in 2013, the Department of Justice put out a memo saying that if you were acting in accordance with a state marijuana law, that you wouldn't be a priority of the federal government. There was a later memo related to activity on tribal land, which basically gave similar guidance. But despite that, it's been a little slow going from what I've seen in terms of having any activity on tribal land. And I can't go into deep detail about why that is, but it does seem like there may be some federal resistance to that. So we'll have to see how that evolves over time. In terms of the cost issue that you raise, that may have to do with the licensing of companies to get involved in this space, and there definitely can be some high barriers to entry, but that really depends on how a state is deciding how their system will be regulated. If they're strictly regulating the number of producers there will be, which then includes all kinds of costs associated with participating in that competitive application process, and sometimes there are also high application and licensing fees as well, which states feel are necessary to cover the cost of regulating the system. So there definitely are costs involved, and that will just evolve over time, and we'll see where that goes. It could be that once tax revenues start coming in, the states have the revenue they need to regulate the system, and the licensing fees can be reduced. But of course, at that point, you may have locked in producers, and it'll be hard for other people to enter. So it's a really dynamic and evolving field. So we'll see how it all evolves.
How are businesses gaining access to banking services?
It's a good question. Yeah, banking can be challenging. Similar to the guidance that was issued in 2013, there was subsequent guidance in 2014 by the Justice Department and the Treasury Department that basically laid out how financial institutions could go about serving people who are involved in the cannabis industry. And that has made it so that financial institutions have become more involved over time once they've developed compliance programs that they and their regulators felt were needed to work with the industry. So it's become better, but certainly a permanent fix at the federal level would be far better than the guidance that exists right now.
And again, the incoming administration could change those efforts as well, and could make it difficult on the industries themselves.
Correct. Yeah, the guidance could be changed in some manner by the new administration, which might, cause financial institutions to re-examine, what is involved and whether to move forward or not.
Audrey's from Florida, Middleburg, Florida, Democrats line.
Hello. I'm a retired drug counselor, and the gentleman you had on before who was a drug counselor, I share many of the same concerns that he had. The main thing, the problem that I have with marijuana, I would hate to see people get arrested for it. I think that it should be, put down to maybe a misdemeanor or something maybe not a fine or something, because I don't think it's good to arrest people for smoking marijuana. But here is my major concern, and I hope you will really hear this. Back when I was doing counseling, my understanding was that if you smoked marijuana on a regular basis, it would stay in your system. And so if you smoked it 2 or 3 times a week, it would always be in your system. So if there is harm connected with marijuana, it's going to be there. And I have personally seen that. It's just be aware. That the marijuana cannabis stays in the fatty tissues of your cells, and all of your cells have fatty tissue. And do you really want that in your system all the time if you smoke on a regular basis?
Audrey, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've said a number of times I certainly want to be sensitive to concerns people may have about marijuana. We're not here to say that it is without harm. I'll say again, substances used every day, from prescription drugs to alcohol to fast food to soda and so on. There are harms associated with all kinds of substances. Marijuana has been studied for decades, and the harms seem to be quite limited. All we ask of drug counselors and others is to provide patients or people whom they meet with, patients, whatever, that they provide them honest information about the relative harms of various substances. If you are talking to patients about marijuana and the harms of use, we hope that you're also talking to them about the harms of alcohol, the harms of opioids, and so on. If it turns out that someone is addicted to opioids, which of course can be deadly, and find that they're better able to treat the pain that they may be treating with the opioids, and they may be able to treat it with marijuana instead, as many NFL players are now talking about, there needs to be an honest conversation about that. We just can't talk about marijuana as if it is so supremely dangerous that it shouldn't even be talked about or considered for use. And again, in a society where alcohol is freely available and freely used, we need to be honest about the fact that marijuana is actually objectively less harmful and should be talked about in that context.
Teddy from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I had a question about if anybody has been discussing or making any headway towards changing the laws regarding random drug tests for jobs and pre-employment ones, because for a lot of people that's actually more oppressive than getting a fine or getting caught by the law. I think the laws, if you smoke a joint on the weekend, like the lady said before, it stays in your system for over a month, and that's not really fair. I mean, a person should not be judged throughout the week for what he did possibly on the weekend. So I was just wondering if anybody's trying to fight that fight or not. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a good question. What we've seen with the ballot initiatives that have passed is that we've wanted to be completely fair to employers and allow things to evolve over time. The initiatives that have passed have generally allowed employers to maintain whatever policies they currently have. As the caller notes, that isn't necessarily fair. Someone who consumes cannabis legally under state law on a Friday shouldn't be at risk of losing their job if they're tested on Monday or Tuesday, because yes, it can stay in the system for a while. But that is something that's just going to have to evolve over time, and we'll see whether employers modify their policies and make sure that whatever policy they have is actually testing for actual impairment and not just the presence of metabolites in the system.
We have a viewer that says, smoking is brutal. It is not healthful. The current model is madness. If it's medicine, make it medicine.
Sure. Well, I mean, there are people who are working on making it a medicine through medicine, and if people want to use it in that way, they will. There are people who are creating vape pens for marijuana, which are like e-cigarettes in a way, and therefore eliminate the smoking. There are also vaporizers that heat the marijuana to a point just lower than combustion, so that you just inhale the cannabinoids without the smoke. And there are other people who enjoy the smoke, and if that's how they're going to consume it, they are, just like we haven't made cigarettes illegal. That will be an option for people. But as people become health conscious about this, if they want to enjoy cannabis without smoking, they certainly can.
What's the edible market look like in this for marijuana?
It's pretty significant at this point. There are a wide variety of products, whether they're tablets or capsules or chocolate or whatever. It is, a significant segment of the market, and some people prefer consuming cannabis in that way instead of smoking or vaporizing.
Let's hear from Jim, and Jim is in Park Hills, Missouri, Republican line. Jim, good morning.
Good morning to you, man. My concern is the language of things. The cannabis, marijuana, hemp. Back in the early 1900s, the U.S. did a survey saying that we wouldn't have to cut, the trees down if we started actually growing hemp and marijuana and things like that. So could you elaborate on the language of marijuana, hemp, and cannabis? That way people kind of get more of an understanding. Well, I support it 100% because I think there's so many more uses for it than just the medical side. Because I've seen where Henry Ford actually made car parts and made fuel and things like that. So if you could just elaborate on the English of it a little bit for me, please.
Sure. Well, let's try to do this briefly. Just starting with hemp. Hemp is, part of the cannabis family, but it's a non-intoxicating plant. Like the flowers you would get from hemp wouldn't be something that you would smoke or consume for intoxicating purposes. It's grown primarily to use the fiber from the stalk, whether it's for clothing or for building materials and so on. It has many beneficial uses. But then you have cannabis, which has THC, a higher level of THC in the flowers, and that is what is used for what's typically known as marijuana, which is really just a name that was put on cannabis back in the early 1900s. Some say, there were racial connotations to it, calling it marijuana, associating it with Mexicans and so on. And that name just stuck over time. So really, but when it comes right down to it, there's the hemp, which is non-intoxicating, and cannabis, which is potentially intoxicating. And then within that, there are a whole range of cannabinoids and terpenes and so on, which would take a long time to get into, but are pretty interesting in terms of how they can be beneficial for health purposes. I would just mention CBD is a cannabinoid, one of the primary cannabinoids in cannabis. Most people hear about THC as the intoxicating cannabinoid, but CBD has many beneficial effects. It's what's been highlighted, like on CNN with Sanjay Gupta, in terms of helping with pediatric epilepsy and so on. And there really are numerous health benefits to CBD.
Last call for our guest comes from Peter, Richmond, Virginia, independent line.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. My question has to do with some confusion I have about the dynamic in which we have regular American citizens voting on whether or not something is medically viable. Isn't that a decision for doctors to make? Isn't that a decision that should be based on good data-driven science and research? Isn't that something that the FDA should be looking at carefully rather than a bunch of regular citizens who are voting on whether or not a certain herb is medicinally useful or not? I don't understand why we're leaving such an important decision to regular citizens rather than scientists, FDA specialists, and so on. I mean, you can't go to a Walmart and get St. John's wort off the shelf without the FDA having had a say about it, without good science and data having had something to say about it. Why is this a decision that we're leaving in the hands of regular citizens? And the same goes...
Caller, sorry to cut you off there only because we're running out of time.
Sure. I mean, it's a really good question. And for an answer, you'd really have to go way back into the war on marijuana. And marijuana was, or cannabis was, a product that was used medically back in the early 1900s. But then the war on marijuana started, and that was no longer there. Studies of marijuana have been blocked for decades. Attempts to do research, attempts to have marijuana cultivated for research purposes, all of these things have been blocked by the federal government over the years. If the federal government had allowed research on marijuana to move forward decades ago, we wouldn't have ever been in a position where the people of states had to vote to make it legal. But the bottom line is that people knew that it is helpful. We've talked about, or I've talked about here, how the use of marijuana seems to be able to reduce the use of opioids in states. It is an effective pain reliever. It helps people with cancer through chemotherapy. It helps people with MS. And the people of the states have realized that there's no reason to arrest patients who want to use this plant that grows naturally to alleviate their pain. And that's where we are.
Steve Fox, he is the co-founder of the National Cannabis Industry Association, also a lawyer on this issue. What's lobbying, or at least what are your efforts going to be looking like in these days before the transition of power? And are you going to directly appeal to the Trump administration?
Yeah. I mean, we're absolutely going to make the case that what is happening now is what the people of these states want. The people of the states don't want people punished for using marijuana, and they also don't want the chaos of criminals and cartels like running the marijuana trade. That's what these states have done. They've said, we don't want criminals and cartels. We want regulated, tax-paying businesses producing and selling this tracked and tested product. And if the Trump administration stands in the way of that, all of the revenue and the business and the crime goes back underground, and that will be worse for everyone.
Steve Fox, thank you.
Thanks.
Coming up, we're going to be joined by the group, the head of the group Freedom Works, Adam Brandon, and he's going to be talking about what faces the president-elect and the Republican Congress when it comes to issues like lowering taxes and reducing regulations. That discussion coming up next on Washington Journal.